The scent of fresh pine and cinnamon filled the air of their modest colonial home in suburban Philadelphia. Margaret carefully placed the hand-carved nativity set on the mantel, the same one they'd used for 32 Christmases. At 61, Margaret was what the neighbors called graceful aging. Her silver-streaked hair was pulled back in her signature low bun, and she wore the navy cardigan Richard had given her last Christmas. She had spent 3 decades being the woman who remembered everyone's birthdays, who organized the neighborhood watch meetings, and who quietly proofread every important email Richard sent from his home office. The woman who had moved their lives twice to follow his career opportunities at Hammond Financial Group. The front door opened with its familiar creak. Margaret felt that flutter of anticipation she still got after all these years. "Dinner's almost ready, honey," she called out, smoothing her apron. "I made your favorite pot roast." Richard walked in, but he didn't head to the kitchen to kiss her cheek like he had for 3 decades. He didn't have flowers. He looked different, sharper somehow in a fitted navy blazer she'd never seen before. His hair was freshly cut, styled in a way that seemed too young for a man approaching retirement. "You're home just in time," Margaret said warmly. "I thought we could eat early and then watch that documentary you mentioned." Richard didn't sit down. He stood at the edge of their worn dining table, looking at the holiday decorations as if seeing them for the first time, as if they belonged to someone else's life. "Margaret," he said. His voice was different. It was the voice he used during conference calls with difficult clients. "Sit down, Richard. What's wrong?" "I'm not going to eat the pot roast, Margaret. And I'm not staying." He reached into his blazer pocket and pulled out a manila envelope. He didn't hand it to her. He placed it on the table next to the ceramic salt shaker she'd bought at a craft fair in Lancaster 20 years ago. The word divorce didn't need to be written on the outside for Margaret to feel her world tilting. "Is this some kind of joke?" Her voice came out smaller than she intended. "It's actually perfect timing," Richard said, pacing the length of the braided rug she'd spent months finding at estate sales. "The kids are settled. The house is paid off. You'll be financially secure, of course." "Financially secure?" Margaret's hand found the back of a chair for support. "Richard, I built this life with you. I supported every career change, every late night, every conference in cities I've never even visited." "Who is she?" Richard paused. Something flickered across his face. Guilt, perhaps, or maybe just impatience. "Her name is Amber. She's a yoga instructor. She's vibrant, Margaret. She's 38. 38. Margaret repeated the number. "The same age as their daughter Emily." "And that's exactly the point," Richard said, his composure cracking. "Look at this house, Margaret. Look at us. Everything is so comfortable, so predictable. You've stopped growing. I come home and I feel like I'm suffocating under the weight of all these years. I need someone who reminds me I'm still alive, not someone who reminds me how old I'm getting." "I gave you my best years," she whispered. "No," he countered, leaning over the table. "You spent them being safe, being careful. You became invisible, Margaret. You're like wallpaper in this house. Amber makes me feel like I can still do anything. You make me feel like my life is already over." He checked his phone. A new model she hadn't bought him. "The movers will be here tomorrow for my things. You can keep the house. I don't need the memories anyway. They're too heavy." He turned toward the door but stopped at the threshold. "Don't make this difficult. You've always been good at keeping the peace, Margaret. Just keep doing what you do best. Stay quiet." The front door clicked shut with a finality that echoed through 32 years. Margaret stood alone in the dining room. The pot roast was overcooking. The nativity set looked like it belonged in a museum. She looked down at the divorce papers, then at her own hands. They were trembling, but not from sadness. For 32 years, she had been the foundation of his life. Now the foundation had been declared obsolete. But as Margaret turned off the oven and watched the holiday lights blink in the darkening room, she realized something Richard had forgotten. Just because someone stops noticing you doesn't mean you've disappeared. It just means they've stopped paying attention. And sometimes, being underestimated is the most dangerous position of all. The art gallery opening in Center City, Philadelphia was exactly the kind of event Margaret had attended 100 times as Richard's wife. She had mastered the art of meaningful small talk, remembering names, and making introductions that advanced his career. Tonight, the marble floors felt colder, the champagne tasted bitter. She shouldn't have come, but 32 years of habit had driven her here. This was the Hammond Financial Holiday Gala. She was supposed to be on Richard's arm, whispering the names of important clients before he shook their hands. Instead, she saw him across the room. Richard was laughing, his hand resting on the small of a woman's back. Amber. She was wearing a dress that looked like it belonged at a nightclub, not a corporate event. Richard looked transformed. He looked like he'd forgotten Margaret existed. A wave of nausea hit her. Margaret turned, seeking an exit, seeking air, seeking anything that wasn't the sight of her life being replaced by a younger version. She pushed through a set of heavy doors at the back of the gallery, ignoring the private event sign. She found herself in a quiet office space that smelled of expensive coffee and leather. The door clicked shut behind her, muting the party noise. "I understand your concerns, Uncle," a voice said, low, measured, and commanding. "But the board's obsession with traditional optics is outdated. I lead Hammond Financial with results, not a wedding photo on my desk." Margaret froze. In the center of the room, framed by floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Philadelphia skyline, stood a man who seemed to command the space itself. Marcus Hammond, the CEO. To the financial world, he was a legend. A man who had inherited a struggling regional firm and transformed it into a national powerhouse. He was younger than the executives he regularly outmaneuvered, with sharp features and eyes that seemed to calculate everything. Opposite him stood an older man in an expensive suit, his face twisted in frustration. "Your competitors are already using this against you, Marcus. James has a wife, 3 grown children, and the image of stability. You're a bachelor with a reputation for being ruthless. The board wants reliability. Give them a wife, or start looking for your replacement." Margaret tried to back away quietly, her heels clicking too loudly on the polished floor. Both men turned. The older man looked annoyed. "Who is this? Security?" Marcus Hammond didn't answer immediately. His dark eyes locked onto Margaret's face. He didn't look at her with dismissal. He looked at her with the intensity of someone who had just discovered something valuable that everyone else had overlooked. He saw the subtle tension in her posture. He saw the faint redness around her eyes. He saw the expensive but understated jewelry, the perfect posture, and the aura of a woman who had spent decades mastering corporate social dynamics. "She isn't security," Marcus said, his voice dropping slightly. He stepped toward her. "She's the wife of Richard Preston, one of our senior financial advisors." Margaret swallowed hard, her dignity the only thing keeping her upright. "Ex-wife," she corrected quietly. "As of about 3 hours ago." Marcus paused. His gaze swept over her again, reassessing. He knew Richard Preston, an adequate advisor who lacked finesse. And then he looked at the woman Richard had discarded. A woman who radiated exactly the kind of quiet, unshakable credibility his board was demanding. A slow, calculating smile touched Marcus's lips. "Excuse us, Uncle Charles," Marcus said, though his eyes never left Margaret. "It seems my stability problem just found an unexpected solution." He walked directly up to Margaret, stopping just close enough to be commanding but not threatening. The scent of cedar and citrus surrounded her. "Mrs. Preston," he said. "It's Margaret. Just Margaret." "Margaret," he repeated, as if testing how the name fit. "Your husband clearly underestimated you. He thinks you're ordinary, forgettable. However, find myself in desperate need of a woman who knows how to navigate a room without saying a word. A woman who understands the internal politics of Hammond Financial better than most of the men who work here." He leaned slightly closer, his voice dropping. "How would you like to stop being the woman behind a mid-level advisor and become the woman who sits at the head of every table he ever dreamed of reaching?" Margaret looked up at him, her heart racing. "What are you asking?" "I'm asking you to marry me Marcus said simply. A business arrangement. 1 year. I need the board to see stability. You need power and independence. I get my position secured. You get a seat at tables Richard will never reach. And when we're done, you'll have enough leverage to build whatever life you want. Without him. Behind them, Uncle Charles sputtered. Marcus, this is insane. She's a stranger. She's divorced. She's perfect, Marcus said flatly, his eyes flashing. He looked back at Margaret. 1 year, Margaret. I get the board off my back. You get access to resources and connections that will make Richard's salary look like pocket change. And when it's over, you'll have the power to make sure he understands exactly what he threw away. Margaret looked through the glass walls. In the distance, she could see Richard laughing with his 38-year-old yoga instructor. She looked back at the CEO. This man everyone in the financial world either feared or envied. The man who was offering her a chance to reclaim something she'd lost. Not just dignity, power. Margaret reached out and took his hand. Her grip was firm. When do we start? She said, her voice steady and cold. The air in Marcus Hammond's private office on the 20th floor was crisp and smelled of leather-bound books and coffee. Outside the windows, Philadelphia's lights spread like scattered jewels. But inside, the atmosphere was clinical and heavy with the weight of a life-altering decision. Marcus sat behind a desk of polished walnut. He looked like a man who had just made a strategic chess move. He slid a tablet across the desk toward Margaret. The terms, he said simply. Margaret didn't pick it up immediately. She looked at her hands. The hands that had packed Richard's lunches, organized his files, and hosted countless dinner parties for his clients. Then she looked at the screen. The numbers were staggering. The compensation for 1 year wasn't just comfortable. It was transformational. There were clauses for a personal wardrobe budget, a dedicated assistant, and a title, special advisor to the CEO. You're not just hiring a wife, Margaret said, her voice regaining its steadiness. You're hiring for a performance. I'm hiring for your experience, your discretion, and your network, Marcus corrected. My board is full of traditionalists who expect me to marry someone they can control. A young socialite or a merger marriage. By bringing you, I disrupt their expectations. You're older, experienced, credible. To them, you'll seem like a safe choice. A woman I married for stability rather than passion. They'll underestimate you. He leaned forward. And that's when you'll help me consolidate my position from the inside. Margaret felt a cold thrill. For years, she'd been told she was too detail-oriented, too observant, too focused. Richard had called it nagging. Marcus was calling it an asset. And what about Richard? She asked tightly. Marcus's expression didn't change, but his eyes glinted. Richard Preston is a small player with modest ambitions. He thinks he's won because he traded security for novelty. He sees you as something he successfully upgraded from. He stood and walked around the desk, stopping just in front of her. I don't just want to give you financial security, Margaret. I want to give you a front-row seat to his irrelevance. In Philadelphia, he's a senior advisor. In my world, under my authority, he's replaceable. Help me secure my position and I will give you the power to show him exactly what he lost. By the time we're done, he won't just regret leaving you. He'll realize that without you, he was never as successful as he thought. Margaret looked at the contract. This was the answer she hadn't known she was looking for. He called me invisible, Margaret whispered. He said I made him feel old. Then let's show him what happens when invisible becomes inevitable, Marcus said. He held out a pen. Signed, Margaret. Leave the suburban housewife in this office. Tomorrow, you become the most powerful woman at Hammond Financial. Margaret took the pen. Felt balanced and purposeful. She signed her name with the elegant script she'd perfected on thank-you notes and holiday cards for decades. But as she handed the pen back, she realized she wasn't signing a settlement. She was signing a declaration of independence. Marcus took the tablet and tapped a command. My assistant has already cleared your schedule. Your belongings will be moved to a secure residence. You'll take nothing from your old life. We have meetings starting tomorrow morning. He walked her to the elevator. his hand resting lightly but professionally on her arm. "One more thing, Margaret," Marcus said as the elevator doors opened. She turned. "Yes. The woman Richard is with. The yoga instructor. Does she know how to read a balance sheet? Does she understand estate planning or tax strategy?" "No," Margaret said. "She knows how to post workout videos online." Marcus nodded, a hint of satisfaction in his expression. "Good. She's a distraction. You're a partner. Sleep well. Your new life starts at dawn." The pre-dawn air in suburban Philadelphia was thick with humidity and the scent of fresh-cut grass, a smell that had always meant home to Margaret. Now, as the black town car idling at the curb waited for her, it felt like the atmosphere of a closed chapter. "1 minute," Margaret told the driver. She stood at the end of her driveway, partially hidden by the old maple trees. A moving truck was backed into the driveway of the house she had spent 32 years maintaining. It was 4:15 in the morning. Richard hadn't even waited for the divorce to be finalized to erase her. The front door opened, spilling warm light onto the porch. Richard stepped out wearing athletic clothes that looked too young for him. He was carrying a box of Margaret's crystal stemware, the glasses they'd used for every anniversary. He didn't handle them carefully. He set them roughly on the truck ramp. Then came Amber. She was wearing bright pink athletic wear, her blonde ponytail swinging as she carried a yoga mat toward the house. She laughed at something Richard said, leaning in to kiss his cheek. Richard beamed, looking at her with desperate, hungry hope for reclaimed youth. Margaret watched as Amber tripped slightly on the welcome mat. The one Margaret's mother had cross-stitched. Amber kicked it aside with a grimace. "This thing is so ugly, Rick. We need everything fresh. New energy, right? Whatever you want, babe." Richard's voice drifted through the quiet street. "Out with the old." Margaret felt a cold, sharp sensation in her chest. Not heartbreak, clarity. She saw the man she had loved for half her life. And for the first time, she didn't see her husband. She saw a stranger who had taken 32 years of her work and was currently handing the keys to her home to someone who couldn't even appreciate a handmade welcome mat. She turned her back on the house. "Let's go," she said as she slid into the car. Marcus Hammond's penthouse was a masterpiece of modern minimalism. Glass, steel, and carefully curated art. As the car pulled into the private garage, a security team was already waiting. Marcus was standing in the lobby, dressed in a charcoal suit despite the early hour. He was on his phone speaking in rapid, decisive tones. He went silent the moment Margaret stepped out of the car. He didn't ask if she was okay. He simply looked at her, not at her clothes or her age, but at the steel in her eyes. "You left it behind," he said. "There was nothing left to leave," Margaret replied. He nodded once, a gesture of respect. "Then let's begin." The transformation began at 7 o'clock that same morning. Marcus didn't send a personal stylist. He sent a team led by a woman named Victoria Chun, a legendary image consultant who had reportedly styled 3 governors' wives. The team descended on Margaret with surgical efficiency. "The suburban mom aesthetic is over," Victoria announced, flipping through Margaret's existing wardrobe with visible disdain. "In this world, your appearance is your armor. You don't dress to be liked. You dress to be respected." For 3 days, Margaret was measured, fitted, and polished. Her soft silver-streaked hair was replaced with a sleek shoulder-length cut in rich chestnut brown with subtle silver highlights that looked intentional rather than aging. Her minimal makeup was traded for a refined, polished look, understated but flawless. The wardrobe, the safe cardigans were donated. In their place came structured blazers, tailored dresses, and shoes that looked like they belonged in boardrooms, not supermarkets. But the physical change was only the beginning. Every evening, Marcus sat across from her in the penthouse's study, a bottle of wine between them, and walked her through the intricate politics of Hammond Financial. "My main competitor is James Rutherford," Marcus said, sliding files across the table. "He'll look at you and see a trophy wife who doesn't belong. He'll try to patronize you. If you react emotionally, we lose ground." Margaret spent hours memorizing the web of board members, investors, and key clients. She learned the subtle art of corporate communication, how a single word choice could shift a power dynamic. "You're learning fast," Marcus remarked one evening, watching her recite the investment portfolio of their largest client from memory. "I spent 32 years making an average man look exceptional," Margaret said, her eyes on the city lights below. "Making an exceptional man look unstoppable is actually easier." Marcus walked over to where she stood by the window. He stood close enough that she could feel the warmth of his presence. "You're not making me look unstoppable, Margaret," he murmured. "You're showing them that I finally found someone who matches my level." For the first time since those divorce papers landed on her dining table, Margaret didn't feel discarded. She felt dangerous, like a storm that had been building strength in silence. Margaret stood at the entrance to the grand ballroom of the Bellevue Hotel, her hand resting lightly on Marcus's arm. She was no longer the woman in the modest navy cardigan. She wore a floor-length gown of deep burgundy silk that moved like water. Her hair was styled in soft waves. Around her neck sat a simple but stunning diamond pendant that Marcus had given her that afternoon. "Remember," Marcus whispered as they approached the doors, "they're expecting a nervous newcomer. They want to see someone out of her depth. Give them nothing." "I spent 32 years being underestimated by men more arrogant than your competitors," Margaret replied steadily. "I'm not the one who should be nervous." As they entered, the room seemed to pause. Conversations quieted. Eyes turned. The whispers followed them like a wave. "Is that her? Hammond's wife? She's older than I expected." A rebound with a good stylist, clearly. At the center of the room, they were met by James Rutherford. He was younger than Marcus, with a practiced smile that didn't reach his eyes. Beside him stood several key board members, their expressions carefully neutral. "Marcus," James said, offering a handshake that was just firm enough to challenge. He turned his attention to Margaret, his smile widening in a way that felt condescending. "And this must be the stabilizing influence we've heard so much about. Tell me, Margaret, how are you finding the transition? Must be quite different from suburban life." The board members watched, waiting for her to stumble, to show discomfort, to prove she didn't belong. Margaret didn't hesitate. She offered a warm but controlled smile. "Suburban life was excellent preparation, James. It taught me the value of patience and attention to detail. But power, I'm finding, translates quite naturally once you understand people." She turned her attention to the woman standing slightly behind James. Eleanor Stanton, a board member and legendary figure in commercial real estate. "Mrs. Stanton," Margaret said smoothly, "it's an honor. I read your interview in the Journal last month about adaptive reuse in historic districts. Your perspective on preserving character while maximizing value was brilliant." Stanton's eyebrows rose. She clearly hadn't expected the new wife to know her work, let alone reference it specifically. But Margaret's attention had already moved. She noticed the way James was watching a server carry a tray of champagne. She noticed the floral centerpiece on the nearby table had been changed from white roses to red peonies. A small detail. Then she saw it. The server approaching Marcus was carrying a specific type of champagne. Vintage Krug. She knew from Marcus's briefing files that he was allergic to sulfites in certain champagnes. This particular vintage was one of them. A seemingly innocent offering that would cause an embarrassing reaction. James had orchestrated it. He'd likely paid the catering staff to specifically offer that bottle to Marcus, knowing a public allergic reaction would undermine his image of control. "Marcus, wait," Margaret said calmly. The circle went still. James's smile faltered. Margaret stepped forward gracefully. She didn't reject the champagne dramatically. Instead, she took 2 glasses from the tray and examined them with the air of a connoisseur. "Krug 1988, she said appreciatively. Then she looked directly at the server. "Though I believe Mr. Hammond requested the crystal this evening. The 1990. There was a note sent to catering." She turned to James with a knowing smile. "You understand, of course. Specific preferences for specific occasions. I'm sure it was just a mix-up." The server, confused but obedient, nodded and retreated. James's face tightened. The trap had failed. Eleanor Stanton stepped forward, her expression shifting from neutral to intrigued. "You pay attention," she said to Margaret. "Always," Margaret replied. The rest of the evening was a carefully orchestrated victory. Eleanor spent the next hour introducing Margaret to key players as the most perceptive addition to our circle in years. Later, in the back of the town car as they drove through the city, the silence between Margaret and Marcus was different. It wasn't the silence of strangers in a contract. Marcus loosened his tie, staring out at the passing lights. "How did you know about the champagne?" "Your files mentioned your sulfite sensitivity," Margaret said, "and I've spent my life watching for the details men think are too small to weaponize. That's where real power lies." Marcus turned to look at her. The calculated distance in his eyes had been replaced by something warmer, something that looked like genuine respect. He reached out, his fingers brushing the silk of her sleeve. "I hired you to be a shield, Margaret," he said quietly. "I didn't realize I was hiring a strategist." Margaret looked at him, the city lights reflecting in her eyes. "Then you'd better start trusting my instincts, because we've only just begun." Marcus didn't pull his hand away. For the first time, he didn't see a contract. He saw a true partner. And for the first time, Margaret realized that the life she was building was going to be far more powerful than anything she'd lost. The rain in Philadelphia didn't fall gently. It came down in heavy sheets that turned the city streets into rivers of reflected neon. High above the storm, in the quiet sanctuary of Marcus's penthouse, Margaret stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows watching the city blur. In the reflection of the glass, she saw him. Marcus was sitting on the low sofa, his jacket discarded, his shirt sleeves rolled up. He wasn't looking at his phone or a laptop. He was simply staring into a glass of whiskey, his expression carrying a weight she'd never seen before. "The gala took more out of you than I expected," Margaret said softly, turning from the window. "It wasn't the gala," Marcus replied, his voice low. "It's the performance. Every day I wake up and put on armor. The CEO who can't be challenged. The man who would sacrifice anything for results." Margaret walked over but didn't sit next to him. She sat on the edge of the coffee table, facing him, close but respectful. "Is that who you are?" she asked. "Or just who they need to see?" Marcus looked up, and for the first time the calculating sharpness in his eyes was gone. In its place was something raw. "When my father died, the board didn't mourn. They circled. My competitors tried to force a buyout before the funeral was over. My so-called allies began positioning themselves to take what I'd inherited. I didn't choose to become ruthless, Margaret. I became it so I wouldn't be destroyed." He leaned back, his head against the cushion. "They call me cold because it's easier than admitting they created the environment that required it. But the higher you climb, the lonelier it gets. Sometimes I forget what it's like to talk to someone who isn't calculating how to use me." Margaret reached out. It was a risk, a breach of the professional boundaries they'd maintained. She rested her hand over his. His skin was warm, his pulse steady, but she felt the tension beneath the surface. "I'm not calculating how to use you, Marcus," she said quietly. "I'm the only person in this city who doesn't want anything from you that isn't already written in our agreement." Marcus's hand turned over, his fingers threading through hers. He didn't pull her closer, but he didn't let go either. The silence between them shifted from professional to intimate. "The contract," he murmured, looking at their joined hands. "It feels like it was signed a lifetime ago." "It was only 4 months," she reminded him. "And yet," he said, looking up at her with uncomfortable honesty, "I can no longer remember what this place felt like before you arrived. It was just glass and steel. Now it feels lived in." The air between them grew charged. For a moment, Margaret thought he might close the distance. She thought she might let him. But Marcus pulled back slightly, though he kept hold of her hand. Instead, he reached for a folder on the table and slid it toward her with his free hand. "I didn't just want to talk tonight," he said, his professional voice returning, though softer now. "I wanted to finalize something." Margaret opened the folder. Her breath caught. It wasn't jewelry or a car. It was a transfer of ownership. Marcus had signed over a 30% stake in Hammond Wealth Management, the division that handled all high-net-worth client portfolios. The division Richard worked in. This is... Margaret scanned the legal language, her heart pounding. Marcus, this makes me a principal shareholder of the division Richard works for. Exactly, Marcus said, a satisfied edge to his voice. You're no longer just my wife on paper. You're now a senior executive in your own right. When the time comes to face your ex-husband, you won't be standing beside me as my spouse. You'll be standing above him as his superior. He squeezed her hand once before finally letting go. I don't give power away lightly, Margaret. I'm giving this to you because you've proven you can handle it. And because, he paused, looking back at the rain, I want you to have a reason to stay that has nothing to do with our contract. Margaret looked from the documents to the man beside her. She had come to Philadelphia looking for survival, for a way to rebuild her dignity. But as she looked at Marcus, this man who had just handed her real authority, she realized the stakes had changed. She wasn't just playing a role anymore. She was becoming who she was always meant to be. And the man sitting next to her was no longer just an employer. He was her ally. Thank you, Marcus, she said, her voice carrying the weight of her new position. Don't thank me yet, he replied, his eyes flashing with familiar intensity. Richard is being transferred to the Philadelphia office next month. He doesn't know yet. Are you ready? Margaret smiled, and this time the steel in it matched his own. I've been ready for 32 years. The air in Richard Preston's home office smelled of stale coffee and mounting anxiety. For 6 weeks, Richard had been struggling. He'd never realized how much of his success had been Margaret's careful organization, her detailed notes, and her ability to manage relationships with difficult clients. Now his inbox was chaos. His client meetings were awkward. The polish was gone. His phone buzzed. It was a notification from Amber's social media. She'd posted a video complaining that he was too stressed and needed to relax more. Richard looked at the screen, then at the stack of files he didn't fully understand. Suddenly, his office phone rang. The caller ID showed Hammond Financial Headquarters. This is Richard Preston, he said, straightening instinctively. Mr. Preston, a crisp voice said. This is Elena from Executive Operations. The CEO has been reviewing our wealth management division. There's been a restructuring. You're being transferred to our Philadelphia headquarters effective immediately. Richard's heart pounded. Philadelphia? Is this a promotion? It's a lateral transfer with new oversight, the voice said neutrally. Your first meeting with the new division leadership is scheduled for Monday morning, 9 a.m. sharp. Don't be late. The line went dead. Richard stared at his phone. Philadelphia, headquarters. Maybe this was his chance. Maybe he was finally being recognized for his own merit, without Margaret's invisible help. He had no idea he was walking into a trap. 12 hours later, in the quiet executive suite of Hammond Financial's Philadelphia Tower, a large screen flickered to life. He took it, Marcus said, leaning against his desk. Margaret didn't look up from her tablet. She was dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, her reading glasses perched on her nose. He's always responded well to the word headquarters. It bypasses his judgment and goes straight to his ego. Look at this, Marcus said, pulling up a social media screenshot on the screen. It was from Amber's public account. A photo of moving boxes with the caption, New city, new energy. Philly, here we come. When you level up, the universe rewards you. Rick's big move. So proud. Margaret stared at the screen, at the man who had told the world his success was due to his new energy, rather than the woman who had built his foundation for 3 decades. He thinks he's being promoted, Margaret said, her voice like winter frost. He's being repositioned, Marcus replied, right where we want him. He walked over to her, resting his hand on the back of her chair. I've arranged for him to report directly to the Philadelphia Wealth Management team. He'll be in meetings all week before he realizes who's actually running the division. Margaret stood, turning to face the window. Below her, the city of Philadelphia spread out in orderly grids. Richard was currently somewhere out there, packing boxes and congratulating himself. He had no idea he was walking into her city now. He's going to document everything, isn't he? Margaret asked. Every moment, Marcus said. By the time he walks into that first meeting, his social media will be a record of his own arrogance. It will make what comes next even more definitive. Margaret felt a cold, steady calm. The trap was set. The pieces were moving. Let him celebrate, she whispered. Monday morning is going to be educational. The executive conference room on the 15th floor of Hammond Financial was all glass and polished steel. Richard Preston walked down the hallway, his new briefcase in hand, his confidence artificially inflated. He'd spent the weekend telling everyone who would listen about his big move to headquarters. He adjusted his tie in the reflective glass. He looked good, or so he told himself. This was his moment, finally being recognized for his own abilities. Two assistants opened the heavy doors to the conference room. The space was impressive. A long table of dark wood, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. At the far end sat Marcus Hammond. He looked like carved authority. To his left and right sat senior executives whose names Richard recognized from company newsletters. Richard walked in, a practiced smile on his face. Mr. Hammond, team, thank you for this opportunity. I've prepared some thoughts on how I can contribute to the division's growth. Marcus didn't smile back. He didn't even nod. He simply gestured to an empty chair at the base of the table. Please, Mr. Preston, sit. We're waiting for one more person. The division lead. Richard began to unpack his laptop, his hands slightly shaking with adrenaline. He glanced at the high-back chair at the head of the table, currently turned toward the window. He assumed it was a senior vice president he hadn't met yet. I've spent over 15 years in wealth management, Richard began, his voice carrying false confidence. And I believe that growth requires eliminating inefficiencies and embracing fresh perspectives. Interesting philosophy, a voice interrupted. The voice was calm, controlled, and impossibly familiar. Richard froze. His laptop slipped slightly in his grip. He knew that voice, but it couldn't be. That voice belonged in a kitchen in suburban Philadelphia. That voice belonged to someone who worried about holiday decorations and grocery lists. Actually, Mr. Preston, Marcus said, his voice dropping into a tone of finality. Before you continue, I should introduce our new principal and division lead, my wife, Margaret Hammond. The high-back chair began to turn. Slowly, deliberately, Richard's breath stopped. The woman who emerged wasn't the Margaret he'd left behind. This woman was transformed. She wore a navy suit that looked like it cost more than his car. Her hair was professionally styled. Her makeup was flawless. Her posture radiated unshakable authority. She leaned forward, her hands folded on the polished table. A platinum wedding band and a stunning emerald ring caught the light. "Hello, Richard," Margaret said. The silence was absolute. Richard's brain refused to process it. He looked for the woman he'd called invisible. He looked for the wife he'd dismissed. He found only power. "Margaret," he stammered, his voice cracking. What is, this is a business meeting." "It is," Margaret interrupted calmly, "and I'm conducting it. I'm the principal shareholder of this division, Richard, which means I'm your direct supervisor." Marcus leaned back, satisfaction evident in his posture. "My wife has been reviewing our wealth management operations. In fact, she's the one who recommended your transfer." Margaret's lips curved into a slight, devastating smile. "I wanted to see this fresh perspective you've been promoting, Richard. The new energy that was going to revolutionize everything." She glanced down at the files in front of her, then back at his pale face. "But from where I'm sitting, you look exactly the same. Conventional, outdated, stagnant." Richard's grip failed. His laptop slipped from his hands and hit the edge of the table with a sickening crack. The screen went dark. He didn't pick it up. He couldn't move. He stood there, humiliated in front of the most powerful executives at Hammond Financial, staring at the woman he treated as disposable, realizing she now controlled his career. "Your performance has been underwhelming, Richard," Margaret said quietly. "Your client retention is down. Your reports lack depth. Frankly, you've been coasting on a reputation that, upon review, seems to have been built by someone else's work." She stood, smoothing her skirt with an air of finality. "You're being placed on a performance improvement plan. 60 days. If you can't demonstrate real value, your position will be terminated." She looked at Marcus. "I think we're done here." Marcus stood, his hand moving to the small of Margaret's back, a gesture of partnership. He looked at Richard as if he were a minor inconvenience. "Security will escort you to your new workspace, Mr. Preston. It's considerably smaller than what you had before. But then, you did say you wanted to embrace change." As they walked past him, Margaret's perfume, something sophisticated and expensive, filled the air, a reminder of everything he'd lost. Margaret didn't look back. She didn't need to. She'd already won. The upscale apartment Richard and Amber had rented in Philadelphia felt hollow. Richard paced the floor, his phone pressed to his ear, listening to his bank's automated system. "Your account has been flagged for insufficient funds," the recording said. "How is that possible?" he whispered. Amber sat on the couch, scrolling through her phone with growing irritation. "Rick, my card just got declined at the salon. This is so embarrassing." "It's just a banking error," Richard said, though his voice lacked conviction. A sharp knock at the door interrupted them. Richard opened it to find a courier holding an envelope. Behind him, leaning casually against the hallway wall, was Marcus Hammond. "We need to discuss your transition," Marcus said, stepping inside without invitation. "My transition?" Richard's voice cracked. "Margaret can't just do this. I have rights. I have a contract." "You had a contract," the courier said, handing Richard a document. Section 12.4. Termination for sustained underperformance and misrepresentation of qualifications. Richard's face went white. "Misrepresentation? What are you talking about?" Marcus walked to the window, looking out at the city. "Your record has been reviewed thoroughly, Preston. It turns out that your most successful years directly correlate with your marriage to Margaret. Your client relationships, your proposals, your presentations, all showed a level of sophistication that curiously disappeared after your divorce." Margaret appeared in the doorway, dressed in a black coat that looked like liquid elegance. "I've been reviewing your files, Richard," she said calmly. "It's remarkable how your work product declined the moment I stopped editing it." She walked toward Amber, who shrank back against the couch. "And then there's your financial situation," Margaret continued. "You took out significant loans to fund a certain lifestyle. Loans that are now being called." Richard's voice rose in panic. "You can't do this. The house, the car, those are mine." "Actually," Margaret said, "they're secured by debt that I now own, through a holding company. Your mortgage, your car loan, your credit lines. I purchased all of it. And as of this morning, I've initiated foreclosure proceedings." The room went silent. Amber stood up, her eyes moving between Richard's shattered expression and Margaret's diamond-hard composure. She didn't say a word. She grabbed her designer bag and started shoving her belongings into it. "Amber, what are you doing?" Richard gasped. "I'm a lifestyle coach, Rick," Amber said flatly. "And this isn't a lifestyle. You said you were a big deal. You're just a guy who got outplayed by his ex-wife." She zipped her bag with finality. "I'm going back to my ex. At least he actually owns his gym." The door slammed behind her. Richard collapsed into a chair. The silence was crushing. He looked up at Margaret, his eyes desperate. "Margaret, please," he choked out. "We had 32 years. The kids, the holidays, the plans we made. You can't just erase all of that. For the sake of what we built together, help me." Margaret stood perfectly still. She looked down at him, and for a moment Richard thought he saw the old Margaret, the one who would have forgiven anything. But then she tilted her head slightly, her expression shifting to something curious and distant. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I think you're confused. She stepped closer, looking at him with the detached interest of someone observing a stranger. I remember a man who called me invisible. I remember a man who said I made him feel old. I remember a man who told me I was the reason his life felt over. She straightened her coat. But you. She looked at him as if trying to place a face she couldn't quite remember. I don't recall building anything with you, because the woman who did that, she doesn't exist anymore. She turned and took Marcus's offered hand. Their fingers intertwined naturally. Goodbye, Richard, she said, not with anger, with indifference. She walked out of the apartment. Marcus followed, closing the door with quiet finality. Richard sat in the center of a life he could no longer afford, surrounded by the ruins of choices he couldn't undo, and realized the worst thing she could have done wasn't revenge. It was forgetting he ever mattered. 1 year in Philadelphia had transformed Margaret completely. The careful, accommodating woman who had spent decades making others comfortable had been rebuilt into something clear-eyed and powerful. As she stood in the center of Marcus's penthouse, late afternoon light streaming through the windows, she looked at her reflection in the glass. She wore a tailored ivory suit. Her posture was confident. She was no longer a woman waiting for validation. She was a woman who had claimed it. The door opened. Marcus entered, setting down his briefcase. He looked at her, and the professional distance that had defined their early relationship was gone. In its place was something warmer, something real. On the desk sat a single folder. It's been exactly 1 year, Marcus said quietly. Margaret nodded. The contract is complete. The board is stable. Your position is secure. The division has seen record growth. Marcus walked to the desk but didn't open the folder. Instead, he slid 2 separate documents toward her. The first, he said, is your exit. Everything we agreed to tripled. You have complete financial independence, property in 3 cities, and board positions at multiple companies. You can walk out of here and build any life you want. You never have to see Richard again. You never have to think about Philadelphia again. Margaret looked at the document. It was freedom, the happy ending she'd thought she wanted when she was standing in that empty dining room a year ago. And the second? She asked. Marcus stepped closer. He held out a second document, shorter and simpler. A new contract, he said quietly. No end date, no settlement clauses, because everything I have is already yours. It's a true partnership agreement, Margaret. In business, in this home, and in everything that comes next. He looked at her, his expression open in a way he showed no one else. I offered you a contract to save my position. I ended up finding the only person who makes success actually meaningful. I don't want a business arrangement anymore, Margaret. I want a real marriage. With you. Margaret looked at the 2 paths, the exit that led to comfortable independence, the partnership that led into the unknown complexity of something genuine. She realized then that she hadn't just used Marcus to escape her past. She'd discovered something she'd never had before. True partnership. Real respect. Richard hadn't made her invisible. He'd just been too limited to see her. Margaret picked up the pen. The same one she'd used to sign that first contract a year ago. She didn't sign the exit agreement. With a steady hand, she tore the exit offer in half and let the pieces fall. Then she signed the partnership agreement. Bold. Final. The terms are acceptable, she said, looking up at him. Marcus didn't celebrate with words. He stepped forward and kissed her. Not the careful kiss of a business arrangement. A real kiss. One that tasted of partnership and genuine possibility. They walked together onto the terrace. The city of Philadelphia spread below them, glittering in the fading light. Margaret could see the office building where Richard worked in his small supervised role. Somewhere in the city, he was struggling to rebuild a life from fragments. But from this height, he wasn't even visible. Marcus leaned against the railing, his shoulder touching hers. What are you thinking? Margaret looked out at the skyline, feeling the weight of real authority and the lightness of genuine partnership. I'm thinking, she said, a small smile touching her lips, that this is the perfect night to start something real. Marcus laughed. a rare and genuine sound, and pulled her closer. They stood there, two people who had found unexpected partnership in a business arrangement, watching the sun set on what they'd lost and rise on what they'd built together. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss